12:59.
I was looking at that clock.
Oh,
Yeah, I don't think it's moved since we've been in here.
That's a trick clock.
It is tricky.
I'm too short to fix it.
Well, do you think I should get started, Kate?
It's 1 p.m. Take it away.
Okay. Well, my name is Bill Deighton, and I'm going to talk today about growing tomatoes in straw bales. I know almost nothing about it. I'll talk about that in a minute. If you have any questions as we go along, just ask them at the time. That way you won't forget before we finish up. First of all, Debbie and I are absolute novices at doing this kind of work. We tried straw bales because we tried growing tomatoes in various ways in the past and had terrible luck. And in fact, I've known some of my neighbors have had a lot of trouble with tomato diseases and that kind of thing. It surprised me really because when I was a kid, my dad had a tomato garden in eastern Pennsylvania where the weather was much more moderate than it is here. And he grew tomatoes just like Jack and the Beanstalk kind of thing. So I was a little disappointed when I realized how hard it was to do that here. But we've only done it 1 year, but we had a great success. We planted the tomatoes right around the beginning of April. We began getting tomatoes at the end of June and July. In fact, we had tomatoes that were ripening up into November. And then finally, the ones that we picked green were good until January. So we had really good luck. So the question here is, what is straw bale gardening? And it's relatively simple. You grow plants in bales of wheat straw. That's important. You don't want to use any kind of what we would call pine straw here. That won't work. And hay is not good. That would work, but the problem with hay is that because basically field grass, it has an awful lot of seeds in it, and you get an awful lot of sprouting from the bales. So use wheat straw. That's the key thing. Now the bales are conditioned for 2 weeks before you can plant, and basically that. Hey there. Hi. Basically that means you go through a process which I'll describe at the end to cause the bales to begin to compost. Really, is what happens, and all that means is that you have to start doing the bales 2 weeks before you want to plant. And when you get ready to plant, basically you chop a hole in the top of the bale, put the plant in there the way you would pretty much anywhere else, and then lock it in place with some potting soil. Now there's some advantages to straw bale gardening. Our experience is that they grow well and you get good yield because you don't have the problem of the disease that you do when you plant in the ground. There's almost no weeding required. In fact, some of the wheat seeds may sprout, but if they do, you just trim them off with a pair of scissors. I mean, literally. There's no digging in the ground whatsoever, so that's awfully sandy, particularly as we're all getting a little bit older. It's convenient. The plants are a convenient height, so they're easy to inspect, they're easy to water, prune, and pick the fruit. And using the bales allows you to put them in a sunny location on your property, which for us meant basically on the driveway, and I'll show you that shortly. In our case, the driveway was close to the kitchen, so it meant we were going to pay attention to the plants, and that way when we needed to pick one, boom, we were right there. So that's one of the things. You want to position the bales in an area that's sunny and convenient to keep an eye on. Now, one of the advantages to this, which I don't know whether had a big impact on us or not, is the fact that the bales decompose over the summer, particularly in the spring when you first treat them, and they get warmer inside. In fact, I've seen some videos where they've actually measured the temperature in the bale, and it may get up to 105 degrees during the conditioning process and then drop back down to around 80 or so to plant. The only question about that, of course, is that you need to watch out for frost, because even if the bale itself is warm, potentially you can get your plants damaged by frost. Whether that happens or not depends so much on the weather actually around here. One thing about this is you cannot overwater the bales. So if you put too much water on, all it does is drain out the bottom. And the plants themselves always have sort of a moist, easily conditioned area in which to grow. And something we have not tried, but the books suggest, is to plant flowers or herbs in the side of the bales. So instead of just planting the tomatoes on the top, you can put plants into the sides of the bales. We haven't tried to do that yet, but we're going to try that this year.
I have a question.
Sure.
Do you recommend just sitting it on the ground, or do you need to put it on, say, a little platform?
I'll talk about that in more detail
Okay.
shortly, but basically it boils down, you can do it either way.
Okay.
And that's as much as anything up to you. Okay, as far as the disadvantages of straw bale gardening, you have the expenses of the bales and the structure, particularly the first year. Now, the structure I used to support things, I just took apart and, in fact, we set it up the other day for the second year. So every year, though, you have the expense of the bales. Now, to give you some idea, I went to Forest Farm Supply and bought 8 bales and 4 tomato cages the other day, and it cost $66. So it's not a negligible expense, particularly if you go to buy the structural materials too. There's some time and effort to set up at the beginning, but I don't know whether that's any more than the effort required to prepare a garden in the ground. You do need to fertilize these frequently, and as I'll talk about here in a few minutes, we fertilized every 2 weeks. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is because you're watering the bale, and the water is tending to drain out the bottom of the bale, it tends to take the fertilizer with it. Now, I don't know about you, but I remember last weekend we had some pretty high winds. And of course, potentially we have hurricanes around here. I think in a hurricane, you're just out of luck, is what it boils down to. But in our case, we have a big farm field to the southwest of us. And quite often we'll have 25, 30-mile-an-hour winds, and it comes whistling right down our driveway. So I had to build a pretty substantial support to resist the high winds. You'll learn a little bit more about that here in a couple of minutes. That's sort of depends on what you choose to do as much as anything. The bales are heavy. Now, they're not too bad when they're dry. When you pick them up, I can easily still carry one without much trouble. But once they get wet, they're really heavy. So what you need to do is make sure that you position the bales where you want them before you water them. That's a key thing. And if you once get them there and then change your mind, not so easy to move them at all. Because as the summer goes on, they tend to decompose more, and they don't actually literally fall apart, but pretty close to it by the end of the year. And someone mentioned the possibility of putting them on the lawn. There's no reason why you can't do that, but it will kill the grass right around the bale, except where the fertilizer goes, and then of course you're going to have tremendous growth of grass in that area. Okay, well now this is what we actually did last year, and we're going to do again this year. You can see, first of all, it's on our driveway and not the grass. One of the reasons I wanted to do that was because of the idea that the diseases that infect the tomatoes sort of come up out of the ground with the insects and other problems like that. So by putting them on the driveway, I wanted to minimize that. I had to put them relatively close to the grass because we didn't want to back over them with the cars. Now, someone asked, can they be low or high? Now, you can see, once again, I raised them up for that same reason, to try to get them higher away from the grass. So the other reason I did that was that in this particular case, I didn't want to anchor anything directly into the driveway. So I built that little structure there where I could use the cinder blocks to weight down the base of the structure. And then with the bales on top, that's pretty secure because they get heavy when they're wet. But you can see, I had to build a fairly substantial structure in order to do this. If you have a fewer bales and you do it on the lawn, it's a little easier to do that.
Do you mind if I take a picture of that?
Oh, go ahead, sure. But I do some woodworking in my spare time, so building something like that was not a big deal for me. But it was fairly expensive. I bought that material last year, sort of at the height of the cost of materials, and it was a couple $100 to buy that wood, believe it or not. In fact, I went and bought some electrical wire, 25 feet of electrical wire about a month ago, and it was $33 for one roll, so it's really getting expensive. The other thing, I knew that if I didn't somehow secure the top of the tomato cages, the whole thing would blow over sooner or later. So I put those horizontal 2x4s first of all, and then they're resting literally right on top of the tomato cages. I don't know whether you can see it too well. And I just tied that with clothesline to hold that in place. And we didn't have any trouble at any time. It stayed like that throughout the whole season. It may be a little hard to see here, but you want to position the bales so the strings run around the outside. Now, there's various arguments about that. You can do it either way. But the problem with putting the strings on the top is that as you go to plant your plant, you might cut the string. And if you cut the string, that's a disaster because the bale's going to fall apart. So I chose to put them around the outside, and that way you don't have to worry about that so much. And of course, you want to put it in a sunny location. In our case, we have trees pretty much all the way around our property, so the driveway was about the sunniest spot. Okay, well, in order to get started, the first thing you have to do is get your bales, get them in position, and begin the conditioning process. Now's the time to start that. In fact, we're going to start conditioning our bales tomorrow. That means we'll be able to plant right around the 1st of April. Keep your bales dry until you put them in place, otherwise they're going to be very heavy and hard to move. Now, these are the kind of things you might have to obtain in order to do your work. Wheat straw bales, fertilizer, and tomato cages, they're all available at Forest Farm Supply. I just bought some the other day. Potting soil, cotton clothesline, materials for the structure, and a hose. You need a hose because you're going to have to water this quite a bit. You can't do it with a bucket or a watering can. All that stuff on that right side, I know is available at Pamlico Home Builders. And it could well be that these things are available at the hardware store in Oriental, but I didn't check them out.
Do you recommend any type of fertilizer?
Yeah, I actually talk about that.
I'm about 2 steps ahead of you.
Oh yeah, I'll talk about that in detail, but at Forest Farm Supply, they have what they call calcium nitrate, and that is a 15-0-0 mix. And you want a high nitrogen fertilizer initially in order to make the bales begin to compost inside. That's what you're shooting for. They had a 50-pound bag, which would last you your life and your grandchildren's lives probably, for $20. But they also sold that fertilizer at 75 cents per pound, which surprised me. Now, to give you an idea, I think a cup of fertilizer typically weighs about 8 ounces. Not sure absolutely about that, but that would give you some idea. When you see this conditioning schedule, it'll give you an idea how much fertilizer you would need. One possibility, if you have some friends that are going to try to do the thing, then you just buy a 50-pound bag and share it. At Pamlico Home Builders, they had a different kind of fertilizer, which is also recommended, called Lawn Starter Fertilizer. That's 2904, I think. And that has twice as much nitrogen in it, so you'll see later that depending on which fertilizer you buy, you use different amounts. At Pamlico, they had a 14-pound bag of that starter fertilizer for $19, and that would probably be plenty for a garden.
What was the name of that?
It's called a lawn starter fertilizer. Now, one caution, I didn't run into this myself because I've never used that particular kind of fertilizer, but one caution is that some of those fertilizers that are made for lawn starting actually have some kind of herbicide in them. And if you use that, that's deadly. You don't want to be putting herbicide on your bales. So make sure that the fertilizer you buy does not have any additional ingredients in it like that. The potting soil, you don't need much of that. That's to anchor the plants. So when you dig a hole in the bale, it's a little bigger than the plant. You just put the plant in and fill around that with the potting soil to lock it in place. The reason I recommend the cotton clothesline is it's fairly cheap. It's easy to cut up into short pieces that you may need to tie things with. Easily lasts throughout the season. It's biodegradable, and it holds knots really well. So if you're not a good knot tyer, You tie it with cotton, clothesline, it'll work. Don't buy the stuff that's synthetic, that will not hold the knot. Okay, we've already talked a little bit about this, but setting up your garden, make sure you put the bales in a sunny location. Place the bales so the strings are on the outside. Make sure your hose will reach to the bale. And try to garden in a breezy area. Now, this sort of seems opposite of what I said about having the bales fall over. But the fact of the matter is, everything I've read indicates that tomatoes do well when they're not wet. We have an awful lot of heavy dew here in the summertime. Sometimes I can't cut my grass until 11 or 12 o'clock in the morning. So if you have a little breeze coming through your plants, that will dry them out. Particularly if you get any water on them when you're watering, which you should not. But if you do, that'll dry them out. That's going to improve the likelihood that you're going to have good results. I think tomatoes need about 6 hours of sun per day. That more is better. So 6 to 8 hours, and you can probably find some place on your property where that'll work. Now, I'm going to give you a handout at the end with the details of how you condition the bales, but this is the general idea. You apply a high nitrogen fertilizer and water it over a 12-day period. During that time, the fertilizer causes the bale to begin to compost inside, actually. It may not be obvious from the outside, but if you were to measure the temperature, you'll actually see the temperature changing as you do that. Now, the temperature will rise, but by the 14th day, you're cutting out the fertilizer and the bale begins to drop to planting temperature. Ideally, the warm bales will give you a head start relative to the cool soil. Now, I didn't actually measure anything on mine. I just tried it and worked. So I'm telling you what worked for us. And later on, I'll give you actually a handout with a sheet with exactly how to do this. Okay, now fertilizer, a little bit I know is that you have 3 numbers. They represent nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You want to condition the bales initially with this really high nitrogen fertilizer. Now, all the books recommend this stuff called ammonium nitrate. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I was able to buy a 50-pound bag of that. I still have some. But when I went to inquire about that the other day at Forest Farm Supply, they said that's no longer available. And the reason is that particular material is what the people use to blow up the federal building in Oklahoma. So as far as I know, that's not available, at least in bags anymore. The lawn starter, the 2904, I know they had that at Pamlico. They might have it at Forest. But what they had at Forest was the calcium nitrate, the 1500. Now, after you go through the first 12 days of the conditioning or so, you actually add some balanced fertilizer that has all 3 components in it and water that in, and that gets the plant started. And then from week to week, as time went on, what we did was use Miracle-Gro tomato fertilizer, and that's a powder that you mix with water, and what we found was 1 tablespoon per gallon of water did our 12 tomato plants. And I had a little trouble, which I'll talk about here in a few minutes, in the middle of the season, and that Miracle-Gro tomato fertilizer seemed to fix that problem. So once again, these are just things that work for us. I don't know much about it other than we got tomatoes. Now, there are 2 different kinds of tomatoes. There's determinate and indeterminate tomatoes. This is important due to the size and when they bear the fruit. And I made a mistake last year of mixing them up, and things didn't work out as well as they could have because of that. The determinate tomatoes are smaller and tend to bear fruit over a limited period of time. So if you want to start out and you don't want to build a big structure, the determinate tomatoes are easier to support because they don't get as big. The indeterminate, however, continue to grow bigger and bear fruit until they're killed by the frost. Now, they do slow down as the fall progresses, but we were still seeing flowers on our tomatoes in October.
How do you know the difference?
Well, it'll tell you right on the tomato plant when you buy it. Yeah, it'll say right on there which one it is. I'll show you what we used here in a minute and which ones were determined, which ones were indeterminate. What I was surprised by, though, is even that the tomatoes that were determinate, like Roma, for example, which we've always had good luck with, tended to continue to set fruit later and later in the season anyway. It was almost as if they had like a big flush of fruit initially, and then after that it sort of just continued a little bit. Okay, now this is what we actually did last year, and the ones at the top are the ones we've had the best success with, the ones at the bottom, not so much. So, Aroma tomato is determinate. It's oval shaped. They call it a paste tomato, but we would eat it every day. It's about 36 inches above the bale. That was the one, even when I tried to grow tomatoes in the ground, I got the best results with. Maybe that's just a tomato that's more suited to our climate. The next thing we had really good luck with was the Sweet 100 last year. A cherry tomato. It's indeterminate and it's very tall, well over 48 inches. They really grow. In fact, they grew up so high they started coming back down in my case. We originally planted them in a pot and they didn't seem to be doing too well. So I moved them out and I just put them on the bale and continued fertilizing them. And what I found at the end of the year when I took everything down, the roots of that plant had grown down through the holes in the bottom of the pan, the pot, and about that far into the bale. It was just amazing. So I'd recommend that one. We had good luck with it, if you like cherry tomatoes, of course. The Celebrity and the Better Boy, we had good luck with. One's determinate, one's indeterminate. They were about the same as far as we were concerned. We got good results. They were about the same size tomatoes, and they're very good tasting tomatoes. The Early Girl was not a particular success for us. It didn't seem to do as well, and it certainly wasn't a lot earlier, actually. So I don't know whether that's due to something we did or what, but I don't know whether we'll try that one again or not. Big Boy, that's one that's been around for decades, but we didn't have much success with that. It got big, but we didn't get a lot of fruit, and the fruit itself didn't look that great. It wasn't any bigger than the other tomatoes we got. Okay, now here's a photograph of our garden, a little bit close up. The two really red tomatoes you see there are a Celebrity, and that was one we had a lot of success with. Just to the right of that, you can see the oval-shaped tomatoes that are not yet ripe. They're the Roma, and they were by far the most prolific. We have an awful lot of Roma tomatoes. Okay, as far as planting is concerned, you want to plant 2 weeks after the beginning of the bale conditioning process. No sooner, because the bale might be too hot, for example. You want to plant after April 15th or perhaps April 1st. Well, everybody wants to get an early start on the season, and for about the last 15 years, I've been keeping temperature records at my house. I know it sounds a little odd, but I keep records. And what I found was that in 13 years where I had the records, there was only 1 year where we had temperatures in the low 30s in April. We had temperatures in low 30s in March, but never in April except for 1 year. And that was in 2016. It was 34 degrees on April 10th. I don't think that would actually kill your tomato plants, particularly if you're willing to cover them. So I think we're going to try to plant April 1st, and if we need to, we'll cover them depending on what the temperature does. Now, the temperature predictions around here are pretty good. You know, if they have a frost warning, chances are you're going to have problems, so you need to get out there and cover tomatoes. If you want to be sure, I would say plant April 15th, and from then on you're going You want to use 2 plants per bale, so you just basically space them in the bale like this. One thing I discovered this year is the bales that I bought were shorter than the ones I had last year by about 3 or 4 inches each. So they just vary from year to year. You need to chop a hole in the top though, big enough to be able to put in the root ball and the potting soil. And we had trouble with that last year. You have to work at it to chop a hole in the bale. They're so compressed. So I used a hatchet, chop, 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 and then I used a pair of pliers to pull the straw out. And that did not seem to damage the bale itself. Didn't make the whole bale fall apart. It worked quite well. But it's a fair amount of work. It's not like just putting a trowel into the ground and making a hole. I keep seeing things that say these peat plants work. You just plant them. They don't work for me. Every time I've tried to do that, put the peat pot from the plant into a pot for flower. At the end of the season, the roots haven't gotten out of there at all. So I always take the peat pot off, and I've had better success. Now, one of the things about tomatoes, which I guess I learned from my dad years ago, is that you want to plant them quite deep, unlike many other plants. So you take off pretty much all the leaves along the stem, except the few right at the very top. You take them all off, and then you make a hole deep enough to put that all the way down, sometimes that far into the bale. And by doing that, then the plant gets a really vigorous root ball because the roots actually come off that stem. And I don't know whether other plants do that or not, but I know the tomatoes work well that way.
Would you say that's like 12 inches?
Depends on the size of the plant you start with, I guess, but it's
Yeah.
possible, yeah. Yeah, now, when you turn the bales with the strings around the outside, the bale itself's about 16 inches high at least.
Okay.
So, you'd have a hard time going down 12 inches, I think. Now, it's a little hard to talk about what kind of support structure you need because so much depends on what you decide to do. I think what it boils down to is use your imagination, whatever works, keeps your plants from falling over, you're good to go. Now, I think generally you can say that it's going to be harder if the bales are raised up off the ground because they're more likely to topple over. It's going to be more difficult to do if the bales are located on a hard surface because you have nothing to anchor to very well. And then if you use the indeterminate varieties to get real large, you're going to have more tending to topple too. But in our case, of course, that's what we did, the top setup there on the hard surface. As long as you had that big structure I built, we didn't have any trouble with that. On the other hand, if you just want to start out and you don't want to build as big a structure, you can place the bales directly on the earth and then use the determinate varieties that stay smaller, and you'll have a little better luck with that. Now, what all the books recommend is there's sort of a combination of the two. You can take your bales and put them right on the edge of the driveway or right on the edge of a walk, and then drive your support stakes into the ground adjacent to the bale. And that way you can build a pretty substantial support even though you're on a hard surface. And I haven't tried that, but I think it would work pretty well. In our case, as the season went on, these plants were getting really big. And in fact, I think you have to plan on some of the tomatoes growing 6 feet above the bale where you put your tomato cage. And what you see me doing there is taking a rope from the upper part of the structure, stringing it across, and then dropping ropes down to each plant so I can train it up. Now, if you use a determinate variety tomato, that's going to not be so much the case. One problem I had here was I ignored the fact that I had 2 different kinds of tomatoes. And you can see one bar is considerably higher than the other. Well, I had some 54-inch tomato cages, and I had some 42-inch tomato cages. And without giving it any thought, I put all the high ones on one side and all the low ones on the other side, but I didn't put the tomatoes in the right place. So I had a problem with that. That won't happen again this year. Okay, as the season goes on now, there are certain things I did that I think helped a lot. And the first one is to prune the lower leaves so that they do not touch the bale. Because as the plant gets bigger and bigger, you don't need those lower leaves anyway. And that's, I think, one of the ways that disease is transmitted up through into the plant. So you want to get rid of those lower leaves. And that certainly doesn't hurt the plant if you let it grow a little bit before you do that. You water gently every day, pretty much required every day to be watering. Some people set up a watering system. I didn't because it was so close to our house. I'm outside all the time in the summertime anyway. Gave me a chance to sort of inspect things and see what was going on. The reason I say water gently is it is possible, particularly initially, to wash the potting soil away from the base of the plant, and you don't want to do that. So what I would do is sort of water in between the plants and at each end of the bale, and then that bale would just suck that water up and provide the water that it needed. Make sure to water the bale only, not the foliage. I used to do that all the time. I'd go out there and I'd give the plant a bath. Oh, there's nothing worse, I think. So what you want to do is make sure you water only the bale down to the very bottom. This helps prevent disease, and I also would try to water in the morning for the same reason, that it would give things a chance to dry out as the day went on. That may not always be possible, but it's desirable if you can. Now, we would fertilize every 2 weeks with Miracle-Gro tomato fertilizer. Now, we didn't do this initially, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But once we started doing that, we had really good luck. Now, that particular fertilizer is pretty much high in all three, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphate. You want to mix 1 tablespoon to 1 gallon of water. I just used an old jug that I had. Always label the jug fertilizer. I applied the fertilizer in this jug after I watered the bale that day, so I wouldn't just wash it right out of the bale. And 1 gallon did 12 plants for us. So if you buy a little container of that stuff, it'll last you a year. It's hygroscopic though, meaning it's going to suck water out of the air. So particularly with our humidity down here. So make sure you close it up tightly after each time you use it, otherwise it'll get mushy inside that box. Okay, well, we did have a few problems, fortunately not many, because I wouldn't have known how to solve them. About the middle of the season, we began seeing some of the leaves yellowing and some of the blossoms dropping off. Well, I did some research at that time because I was afraid we were infected with something. But the problems I've had in the past, the plants just turned black and all over. This didn't look like that. So after doing the research, what I found was it was probably a lack of nitrogen. And of course, you're watering the bale so much that the fertilizer can be drawn out of the bale. So that's when I started using the tomato fertilizer. And within a week, everything looked better. I mean, it was just amazing how big an improvement that was. So that's why I recommend maybe using the tomato fertilizer throughout the whole period. We did not have any trouble with tomato diseases. If we had, I don't know what I would have done, but everything looked good right until the end of the year. So I don't have any recommendations on that. I have seen some things on the internet that there are various things you can spray the plants with to help prevent that. Some people recommend baking soda, some people recommend copper sulfate, but we didn't do any of that, and I prefer to put as little on the plants as I can, and we didn't have any problem. So maybe it was just luck, I don't know, we'll see this year.
Use neem oil.
Oh, neem oil, yeah, I've heard of that one too. We did have a little problem with the birds, however, particularly red-bellied woodpeckers. We feed the birds, so they're coming to the feeder that's 50 feet from the garden. We like the woodpeckers, so what do you do? Well, if they peck the tomato plant and you see it that day, just take it in and eat it. You know, they don't eat much. But we also found that if you pick the tomatoes a little bit green, not really green, but just shy of bright red, take them in the house, let them ripen for a day or so. For some reason, the birds are picky and they don't tend to do any damage to those tomatoes that you picked earlier. As far as insects, we didn't have any problem with insects, at least enough to deal with. Occasionally we'd see a little leaf that had been chewed by something, but the problem with this is that tomatoes are pollinated by insects. So if you start spraying for insects, you might kill all the pollinators. So we just forgot about it and things worked out okay for us. In fact, several times I saw hummingbirds there. I don't know whether they actually pollinated the flowers or not, but they were certainly right around the garden. Squirrels. We have a lot of squirrels. But they didn't bother the tomatoes too much, I think because they were too full of our bird seed. So, I mean, they're like this. We have so many squirrels we name them. We have one called Bobtail, who only has a tail about that long. But fortunately, they didn't seem to get into the tomatoes. We'll see next year. And I know a lot of people have a problem with deer with their gardens, and we certainly have deer in our area, but they don't ever seem to really come right on our property near the house. And I'm not sure why that is. We don't have a dog or anything like that, but they don't, we've never seen them on our property, so we didn't have any trouble with the deer.
Do they eat tomatoes?
I don't know.
They'll eat pretty much. They
Yeah,
walk in there,
I know.
they have some that come up behind our house and they'll walk right in front of the living room window over to the garden. You have to go out there and chase them off.
You know, I've heard, I've never tried this because I haven't needed to, but I've heard that people have motion-activated sprinklers, and if a deer comes near the garden, it shuts the sprinkler off, and that's it, to chase them away. Yes?
Bill, has anybody in the room had any box turtles on 2 legs reaching up on the cage to eat the?
Well,
I don't know if it was a box turtle. I know it was a turtle, a pretty good sized one. that was
Yeah,
up
probably a
into the
box
little-
turtle.
yeah, actually, in past years, I have actually seen the turtles walk over to the tomato plant and reach up and grab it. And you'd be surprised how fast a turtle can move when they're interested in tomatoes.
And raccoons.
But see, that's one of the virtues of having them as high as I did. There was no way a turtle was gonna get up there.
That's probably the best thing about this is, because we got box turtles by the dozens.
Well, you know, they do cook turtle soup.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you had a recipe for that.
You know, I got my dad a book one time. It was 101 ways to outwit squirrels at your bird feeder. And they had done all sorts of research. In fact, they were talking to a guy at the University of Maryland about squirrels, and he was a squirrel expert. And they said, what do you do about the squirrels at your bird feeder? He said, well, you treat them just the way you would chicken. And the guy said, what do you mean, like chicken? He said, well, any recipe works for chicken, works for squirrel.
We had some in pots on our back deck
Uh-huh.
last year, and we would go out there, and there would be chunks of stuff, of the tomato
Oh,
gone. And we never did figure out, because we have lots of squirrels too, but we never did figure out why it was that. And we would find them, you know, down at the bottom of the deck, where they had,
it could have, I'd say it would be either the turtles or the birds, probably.
Listen, we had them where we walked across the backyard one time, and a tomato that had a bite out of it fell from the tree down in front of us. So we know it was the squirrels, and they didn't care if they were green or red or yellow. They did not care. They ate it.
All you have to do is feed them more heavily with that bird seed.
There you go. There you
with the
go.
peanuts and right there.
Corn cobs or whatever, and I lined them up on my railing back by the kitchen, put the corn cobs out there. And with the raccoons, I just put a bucket of the bird seed out there. We had the fattest raccoons out there, but they stayed away from my garden.
Yeah, and we have raccoons and opossums. We even had a bear knock our bird feeder down one time.
Oh,
But
wow.
fortunately, we haven't had any problems with it that I've noticed anyway. Okay, well, at the end of the season, watch the weather for the coming frost. Now, in our case, last year, we picked our tomatoes, all the green ones that were left on November 13th. And we knew the frost was coming because they made a good prediction, and we knew that it was gonna kill the plants, and we didn't, at that point, we didn't wanna fool around trying to cover them up or anything. So what we did, we picked all the green tomatoes before the frost. We just took them into the kitchen in low boxes and just left them there. And it was a little messy, but it had the virtue of allowing you to watch all the tomatoes at the same time, and as they ripened up each day, we just used them. So we had tomatoes right on through until the early part of January that way. And surprisingly enough, even though they were hard green when you picked them, they still tasted pretty good in the middle of December. Now, all of us recommend that you remove the plants and bag them up and put them in the trash. Because if you do have any kind of a plant disease, you don't want to put it in your compost pile. And that's what we did, although we didn't see any signs of disease. Now, then you need to take down your structure and save it for next year. In our case, even though that had that big thing, it probably took an hour or so to take it apart. I use screws that I can just drive in and just take right back out, and that worked fine. Now the bales themselves are going to be falling apart. I mean, literally, by that time of the year, they're going to be just collapsing down to nothing. They're still contained by the string, but they're literally falling apart. So in our case, since we didn't see any sign of disease anywhere along the way, I took them and removed the string from the outside. That's some kind of synthetic fiber, never compost, and just put all that on my big old compost pile out in the field, and it'll be there for another couple of years before I have some reason to use it. Okay, now here's some resources that will be helpful to you. The first one is actually a book that I got out of the Pamlico library, and I'm going to return it as soon as this is over, so if anybody wants to go up there and borrow it, you'll be able to. It's called Straw Bale Gardens by Joel Karsten. Things like this I tend to buy because I want to keep them for a long time. You can buy that as a paperback for $17 or on your Kindle for $12. But I didn't actually use this book. I didn't have it last year. What I used is the second one down, called Growing Vegetables in Straw Bales, this little guy here. And what I found when I looked at them both pretty carefully was there wasn't much different in content. Pretty much everything that was in this one was in that one. And that one you can buy for $8, so I'd recommend this little guy. Now, the big difference between these is this book has many more illustrations in it. And I think that's the fundamental difference. As far as the content, they both seemed about the same. Now, this guy, Joel Karsten, he claims to be the guy that invented this. Whether he did or not, I don't know. But he has a website called strawbalegardenclub.com. It's a commercial site, so they're going to try to sell you stuff while you're there. But they did have a series of good videos to study, so that's an easy thing to do. And if you go on YouTube and search on straw bale gardening, you're going to find many videos, many videos. Some of them are very good, some of them not so good, but I think all the people that do that are trying to help. Now, all this information that's on that slide is also on the handout I'm going to give you here in a minute or so. Okay, does anybody have any questions right at this point before we get into that conditioning? I must have done a hell of a good job.
Hadn't tried it yet.
Okay, let me hand out these instructions on the conditioning.
I did want to say, like, for birds and stuff, I did find that if you use, like, the red ornaments at the end of the season for Christmas, if you buy the red ornaments and hang them around your tomato plants, when they go and peck them, and it's hard and it's not a tomato, they usually will leave them alone. That or take pie tins, like the little cheap pie tins, and paint them red, like a tomato would be, and hang them up, they'll stay away from them.
That's a good idea. I've never heard of that one, but that, to me, that sounds like a really good
My
idea.
grandmother swore by the pie tins, but I learned the little trick with the red,
Yes, this guy.
the red Christmas balls that you can get on sale after Christmas.
Thank you.
That's a problem I have at my age too sometimes. You got your glasses on.
Choose and look at that.
Okay, while you're taking a look at that, I'm gonna sort of summarize it up here, and after you've had a few minutes to study that, then we'll go over the general idea.
Hey, Bill, one thing you haven't, discussed much is, this sounds like a great plan. What do you do if you have 2 inches of rain, 3 days running?
You mean, after the garden started?
Well, during this period of 12 days.
Oh, as far as during the conditioning part?
Yeah.
Okay. I think you would sort of say, okay, at that point, I'm just gonna act as if those 3 days didn't work and then go and continue the process. I haven't had that problem, but it's certainly a possibility around here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility. Okay, I don't know whether you'll be able to see that too well because it's a little bit small, but still, it's just a summary of what's on that page. Now, on day 1, day 3, and day 5, you apply the fertilizer, and that's that high nitrogen fertilizer. Now, it's either 1 cup of the 15-0-0 or 1/2 cup of the 29-0-4. Now, because that first number is the percentage of nitrogen, if you're using something that has half as much nitrogen, you have to use twice as much material. So it's one or the other though, you know, just get one and use it and use the appropriate amount. Okay, then the second day you water it. The third day you do this again. 4th day you water it. The 5th day you do that again. 6th day you water it. Now, after you've done that basically for the first 6 days, then on these days, each one of those days, you're gonna do the same thing, but with 1/2 as much. So if you were using a cup to begin with, use a 1/2 cup. If you were using a 1/2 cup to begin with, use a 1/4 of a cup down here. And you fertilize it and water it. When you water it, you want to water it enough so that you're not necessarily streaming the water out of the bottom of the bale, but the bale is really soaked, you know, it has to be. Okay, now, once you've reached that point, you want to change to your balanced fertilizer. And that might be 10-10-10, 8-8-8, pretty much anything like that. They call it balanced because it has all 3 of the nutrients in it, in the same material. So what you do then is you put the balanced fertilizer on and water it in good. And then on days 11 and 12, you just water them. And then day 13 and 14, you stop. Don't do anything. And the reason for that is that you're gonna plant on day 15, and you don't wanna have a big mud puddle out where you're trying to work. You know, the bales are too soft and too wet, that's not good. So by letting them sort of settle for 2 days, you're gonna be okay. Now, of course, Jim raised the question, what happens if you have a lot of rain during this period? And I think, for example, if you were to have 3 days of rain right at this stage, I would just stop at that point and then continue with this. Now, there's actually a way of doing this by doing nothing, according to the books I've read. I haven't tried it, but they say that all you need to do is put the bales out there and wait a month, and they'll be ready to go because they decompose naturally. But I'm not generally that far-reaching ahead of what I'm doing, so this will get you there. Does anybody have any questions about this? Because this is the most complicated part of the whole thing, really. Well, now, at this point, does anybody have any questions about anything you'd like to ask me? Well, if not, I'd like to encourage you to support the effort to build a new library that's going to be coming up over the next couple of years. I'm a big enthusiastic guy about libraries. In fact, when I was in junior high school, I wrote an article for the junior high school newspaper called Library Corner. So I've been a big enthusiastic supporter of a library for a long time. Okay, well, I appreciate your attention today, and if you have any questions, I'll still entertain them.
Thank you very
Thank you. As a reminder, she said this will be videoed and placed online.
Oh, I had forgotten about that. Yeah, in fact, that computer over there is videoing me right now, and I didn't even know it. Jim?
Yeah, I got a question about, number 3.
Number 3?
Number 3 on the page there. Please support the new library.
Oh, yeah, okay, sure.
So we got a building over here that is gonna go in. Where are we as relates to getting into that building?
Well, I can give you a little information, even though I'm not specifically involved in that process.
Right.
I think where we stand is a committee has been formed among the Friends of the Library to begin a fundraising effort to raise the money to do the actual construction. We've gotten quite a bit of money from the state so far, and they're going to be asking for donations from community organizations and individuals. I'm certainly going to contribute to that. But with the cost of the building materials increasing so much, the price of the library has really increased. A lot of this has been done purely by volunteers. In fact, the fellow that designed the library, local architect named Mr. Vick, he did that all gratis. So I think we're several years away from the completion of that, but I think we have to be positive and say it can be done.
Yeah, because I don't think everybody in the county understands, this is not something people just think is a good idea. The public library has got to leave the school library. They are the same thing. And there's not enough room in here. The school wants to take it all over. If we don't do something, we won't have a library. And I think there's a lot of people that don't understand that.
I think you've summed that up pretty well. The school has supported the library for almost 40 years, and they now want this area. We've got a 5-year lease at the moment that's about halfway through. From what I understand, the school will continue to support us until the new library is built. But I think you're quite right that most people don't understand that situation.
It's not just some wild dream somebody had, moving to an old Hardee's for a library.
Right, right. That's why we're moving in that direction.
Thank you, enjoyed it.
Sure. Any other questions? Well, I appreciate your attention.
Appreciate your time.
Oh, good. I hope it all worked out for you.
See you later, Bill.
Thanks for coming. Take care.
Catch you later, Bill.
Okay. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Well, good.
Thank you.
Oh, not the tomatoes, the
It's
sauce.
only part of the Hardee's
We,
building and then they're adding.
yeah, when we got buckets of tomatoes and we
Existing
just make sauce
building
from it.
Hardee's in where the